Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of On the Whistle, another midweek special now. As we've been doing for the last few weeks when there's no midweek game, taking the opportunity to take a little bit of a step back and a little bit of a deeper dive into a bit of a different topic. And this week I thought it would be, I was going to say I thought it would be interesting to look into the Premier League's new financial rules. Maybe that's not quite the right term. Warning, this is going to be about finances, so totally appreciate if that's not your cup of tea. But I think as we've seen in the last few years, this has become a massive part of the modern game, and I think that this is a pretty significant change that Premier League clubs have voted through. So in case you missed it last week, I'm sure most of you have seen the headlines. Premier League clubs voted to bring an end to the current set of financial rules that govern the Premier League, profit and sustainability rules, and from next season they're going to be bringing something different in, which is called the squad cost ratio rules. So I thought it would be interesting, A, to actually break down what's changing, how these new rules actually work, and then B, to answer the question that when I kind of put this out last week, the most common response I had was, is this a good thing for Sunderland or not? It probably won't surprise you to hear that the answer is quite complicated, and I don't think there's a really straightforward answer, but that's what most of this video is going to be breaking down. Does this change? Will this, if Sunderland stay in the Premier League, let's be optimistic at the moment, but if Sunderland is still in the Premier League next season and beyond, does this mean they have to change their model, and how will it impact how they operate? The simple answer is not an absolutely massive amount, but there are some really important things to take away from it as well. So what is the difference between PSR and squad cost ratio rules? So PSR runs over a three-year period, and it looks at how much a club loses. So Premier League clubs are limited to a loss of £105 million over a 3-season period, and this takes into account everything in the club. There are some notable exceptions, so investment in a club's academy isn't included, investment in a club's women's team isn't included, but generally speaking, it's a pretty simple look at how much money a club loses each year or is in profit. And the penalties come in if a club is averaging more than the club is losing more than £105 million over a 3-year period. Now, the squad cost ratio has some similarities, but it also has some major differences. It operates on a season-by-season basis, and it applies purely to first-team costs. So the way these rules work is that Premier League clubs are going to be able from next season to spend 85% of their club revenues on first-team costs. Now, there's a difference here between the revenues encompasses the whole club, so that's their TV money, any profits they make from player trading, match day revenues, so that's retail, commercial, etc. Any profit that they make from hospitality, things like concerts, this all goes into the pot. But the money that's counted in terms of their spending is just first team costs. So it'll be clear this is wages for the head coach and the first team squad. This is amortization, that's basically transfer fees, which in football accounting terms are spread over the length of the contract rather than as the upfront sum. Agents' fees, and I think that's about it. So basically, 85% of whatever a club earns in total, they can spend on first team squad costs. So this is a fairly significant change, and there's a little bit of a sting in the tail as well, which is there is a pretty significant caveat built into this. What I would basically equate to is like an overdraft as part of the system that gives teams a little bit of a leeway. And that's why I think the simplest way to understand these rules are similar to what was in place before, but a important relaxation of them to a large extent. So the projected revenues will be agreed by the clubs in the Premier League. So the Sunderland, if they're still in the Premier League, will sit down with the Premier League next summer and they will come to an agreement about the club's projected revenues. This will be based on what the Premier League knows it's going to distribute in broadcast money the next year. It will be based on Sunderland's past revenues and what the projections are for it for the next campaign. And that revenue, that sum will be set, and that'll be what the 85% figure is counted against. Now, the 85% figure is called a club's green threshold, but they will also have a red threshold, and this is basically the overdraft, and this is something that's really important to understand. So there will be an additional 30% threshold, if you like, whereby clubs, if they go over the 85% figure, they will be fined, but they won't be given a sporting sanction so long as they are within the red threshold, which will be 110% of their revenues for that projected revenues for that season. And this basically works as a bit of leeway that you then use up. So to give you an example, if Sunderland next season in the Premier League spent 95% of their agreed projected revenues on squad costs, they would get a fine but not a sporting sanction, and then the next season their red threshold would come back down by 10%. So the next season their red threshold wouldn't be 110% of their projected revenues, it'd be 100% because they've used up 10% of their overdraft, if you like. So that's a really important point, because it's only at a point at which team goes past their red threshold that they'll get a sporting sanction, i.e. a points penalty. This is a really significant change, but I think it's fairly clear the Premier League wanted to move away from points deductions as much as is possible, because they'd proven to be so controversial in the past, and this is a pretty significant way of reducing the likelihood of that. So there is still ultimately the threat of a sporting penalty and a points deduction, but I think it's fair to say that it will be less significant, or less regular is probably a better way to put it, under the new system. So it's a really interesting debate, because the reason why these changes are happening basically is because PSR has been criticised quite heavily for basically making the Premier League a bit of a closed shop. There's the argument for really ambitious clubs that our owners have significant resources, they want to invest them in the football club, they want to invest them so that we can bridge the gap to the top six. Why shouldn't they be allowed to do that? And this is essentially a bit of a response to that by focusing on revenues rather than losses. They're essentially giving teams a bit of an extra leeway, while also trying to maintain some element of ensuring clubs are spending relatively sustainably. Now, I personally actually don't think PSR was that bad a system, because I think it's incredibly risky to let owners rack up huge losses and significant debt, because it's all well and good saying that they have the resource and the intent to fund the clubs now. But obviously, we've seen time and time again that isn't always infinite, and that things can change in football. And if owners lose their appetite or their own kind of financial situation gets impacted, clubs can be impacted really quickly and really heavily. So it's not an approach I'm massively in favour of, to be honest, but that's just my personal opinion, and you potentially don't particularly care about that. The significant thing here to understand is that this is essentially a little bit of a relaxation for the clubs who feel like their spending has been hamstrung a little bit. And I don't think it's any coincidence that it's been widely reported that the clubs who've done well under PSR, Brighton, Brentford, Bournemouth, were against this move. And that's because they're consistently making significant profits on player sales, and they're good sellers and they're good buyers where they get players under their market value because they've got a great eye for talent and for potential. PSR has worked quite well for them, and it's probably allowed them to compete with teams who have owners with bigger resources or much, much bigger revenue streams, but have been hamstrung by the fact that they haven't spent particularly well on wages or have wasted money in the transfer market. So I'm not completely convinced personally that this is a positive move for football more generally. But that's kind of a bit of an aside, I suppose. That's just my personal opinion, and you'll all have your personal opinions on it. One interesting quirk of the system, which is something that the Premier League have kind of touted as making the division more competitive, and I suppose would be an answer to that previous point, is that teams competing in UEFA competitions, Conference League, Europa League, Champions League, are already limited to spending 70% of their revenue on a calendar year on first team squad costs. So that means the fact that there's an 85% limit means that clubs who aren't in European competitions in any one given season will be able to spend 15% more of their projected revenues than clubs in Europe who have to adhere to these other rules. So there is this sense that the Premier League would argue that it's increasing competition because it gives teams a realistic chance of cutting the gap to the teams who are already in European competition. The reality is that those clubs in European competitions genuinely have such extraordinarily massive revenue streams that it might not make a huge difference in practice, but that is worth pointing out. Point of order in terms of how these rules will be applied. So basically every club will be given a test on March the 1st. If it looks like they're going to be in excess of their green threshold, they'll then have another test in June where basically the club, the Premier League, will go through their accounts. They'll finalise what their actual revenue was, what their actual spending was, and that's when the decision will be made about where they are in their threshold and whether any further penalties are needed. So that's just one kind of just thought I'd mention that in terms of how the system actually applies. So what I want to get into is this good for Sunderland? Because I've already been talking for 10 minutes. So I think this is a really, really interesting debate. The first thing to point out is our understanding is that Sunderland did vote for this. So that would suggest that they think it's a system that will relatively benefit them over a period of time. And crucially, it's clear that they don't think they're going to have any issues complying with this system in the next couple of years, i.e. they think they're going to be fairly comfortable in terms of where their current costs are and where the revenues at. So I think that's an important part to start from. Now, we don't know exactly the reasons why they were in support of it. I'm just going to have a sip of my coffee. But I think we can make a few assumptions about why in the short to medium term, this is a decent system for Sunderland, I think. So if you're looking at the clubs that Sunderland are competing with, and let's be fair, it's been a brilliant start of the season, but the goal for the next 3 to 5 years for Sunderland is to stabilise in this division, to become a stabilised, established Premier League club. Well, one big advantage that you've got is that you have a hugely dedicated, hugely passionate, hugely invested fan base. You are getting, as long as the team's doing well, even if the team's not doing particularly well, you are pretty much guaranteed to sell out your 48,000 seater stadium in Sunderland. And that is a huge boost in a revenue-based system. Sunderland know that they have a stable revenue base that's going to compare favourably to a lot of the teams that they compete against. And there's one really significant part of this as well that I think is why, if I was in Sunderland's shoes, I'd probably favour this system. That's also a sustainable, reliable revenue base that is probably going to be better than most of the teams who get promoted, if not all of the teams who get promoted out of the Championship. I don't think this system makes it any easier for teams who get promoted out of the Championship to bridge the gap. I actually think, if anything, it might make it harder, because under PSR, you could essentially do, to a degree, what Sunderland did because of the good finance work they've done in the years previous, and also what we saw with Nottingham Forest a few years ago, where you essentially front load your investment. So you spend a lot of money improving your squad, investing in your squad in the first year, knowing that realistically you're going to probably rack up quite significant losses. But then if in the second and third year of your PSR cycle, you've then got wriggle room to kind of get back on an even keel, if you like, within the rules. And if you've stayed up, your revenue streams become much stronger and the whole process becomes much easier. Because this will move it to a season-by-season basis, it's going to be much, much harder for teams who get promoted to do that. So I think the system will have benefits for Sunderland as they look to stabilise in the Premier League, because I think that the size of the fan base and the general reliability of the revenue streams will be a positive. The flip side of this is I think it will make it harder to get to the top level, if you like, because as I mentioned before, now again to stress, player trading is still absolutely vital in this new system. If Brighton, Brentford, Bournemouth continue to buy and sell really, really well, then they'll be able to thrive under the system, because player trading is still obviously such a massive part of revenue. But I think that switching to a revenue-based system, clearly, even with the caveat that they can spend a little bit less of their revenue that I've mentioned before, it clearly benefits teams who are competing in Europe, whose revenue streams are naturally bigger. And it absolutely benefits the team who are established in the Premier League, have been established in the Premier League for a long period of time, and have been growing their revenues, whether that's through the domestic attention, or more specifically through the absolutely massive international attention that you now have in the Premier League. This is something where realistically, because someone spent such a long time out of the Premier League, they're quite a long way behind. And this is why I think the system will potentially make it harder for them to cut the gaps at the top. And that is why player trading and selling players at the right time, investing sensibly, is still going to be absolutely massive, because Sunderland will need that to make up the gap in their revenue streams over the next couple of years. So I think this is kind of the key point. Revenue is a word that, if Sunderland stay in the Premier League and stabilise at the Premier League, as the signs at the moment look relatively hopeful for, revenue is going to be a word that we use a lot over the next 5 to 10 years, because in this system, building revenues is going to be absolutely vital. And it's going to be really interesting moving forward, because we've seen that the club have moved to Hummel, for example, as the kit partner, moved to Fanatics as the retail partner. They've joined up with Delaware North for the concourse, who are obviously overtaking the kind of match day hospitality operation. Now, we know that the product is better. We've seen it in the kits. We've seen it in how much better the concourses are this season. We know that the sales are better. What we don't know is how much that is improving the club's financial situation in terms of its commercial revenues. We won't know that until the next couple of accounts drop for last season early next year, and for this season the year after that. So we still don't quite have that picture, but it really does emphasise that the club is going to have to work really, really hard to build its commercial revenues, its sponsorship revenues. that will go hand in hand. If you're able to stay in the Premier League, you will get better contracts. Sponsors and investors will feel a lot more comfortable because they'll feel as if you're going to be a Premier League team for a period of time. So they'll invest more and they'll invest on longer terms. So that's an important part of it. But it's going to be a real challenge and a big thing for Sunderland so far. Can they capitalise? We know that because of the documentary, we know because of all the till the end stuff last year, there's a huge kind of interest in Sunderland at the moment, and there's definitely potential there, and it's something that Sunderland are going to have to really work on in the next few years. I think it's obvious to say that this system will benefit the tradition, like what we now know is kind of the big six, if you like, in the Premier League, and also teams who are in a position where their match day revenues are massive because of hospitality and what they're able to kind of charge on that front. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an insight into how this new system is going to work. I just want to talk about a little bit to end whether this means that Sunderland are going to have to change their model or the way of operating. The answer is fundamentally no. It's not, because as I've alluded to there, player trading is still going to be massive. I would argue that this doesn't reward teams who recruit and sell well as much as PSR does, and personally I don't think that's a good thing, because with it being a season-to-season basis, I think the clubs who don't have huge revenue streams, who traditionally have got into the position they have by recruiting bravely and selling bravely, I feel like the system will push you one or two bad windows away from setting you back a long way, and that doesn't necessarily feel entirely fair, because at the moment PSR does, broadly speaking, benefit teams who recruit and sell well over a long period of time. But player trading is still massive, especially for the clubs who don't have the same level of revenues at the moment as the clubs higher up the table do. Player trading is going to be a massive part of bridging that gap. So Sunderland's fundamental model of investing in young players, of selling them at the right time, is still going to be an absolutely massive part of how they kind of cut the gap, if you like, or bridge the gap and climb up the Premier League tables. As I say, one big thing it does stress, and Sunderland aren't alone in this, there's so many clubs in the Premier League and now starting to think about how they grow their revenue streams away from the football pitch. Some of that's on match day, but some of it, well, a lot of it really is away from match day. What other revenue streams can we have? One thing that I think just moving this completely away from Sunderland more generally and into a football thing is going to be interesting to see how this develops over the next few years, and absolutely vital, I think, that these costs aren't pushed onto match-going fans who are already now spending a huge amount of money on their tickets. I think it's important that the clubs don't use this change as an excuse to drive matchday ticket prices up further, and that's going to be something I think to watch. That's not a Sunderland thing, that's a general football thing over the next few years. So yeah, hopefully I have given you a little bit of an overview. I am certainly not an accounts or a finance expert, so please keep that in mind. Hopefully it's given you a little bit of insight into what these changes actually mean, though, and some of the positives and negatives that will come from it from a Sunderland perspective. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much for watching. If any of you have made it to the end of this finances video, 18.5 minutes in, thank you and well done, much appreciated. We'll of course be back this weekend, loads of coverage around the Bournemouth game. We'll be bringing you the updates from Regis Brice's press conference ahead of that game. On the Whistle will be back obviously on Sunday after the Bournemouth game, and then there'll be a couple of On the Whistles next week, because of course we've got those slightly scary but also incredibly exciting games away at Liverpool and Man City. So absolutely stacks of content coming up, so please keep your eyes and ears out for all of that. And as ever, thanks so much for watching.